Luthien and Arwen, the two most famous elven women to fall in love with mortal men. Everyone assumes Arwen just followed in Luthien's footsteps, made the same noble sacrifice, and got the same bittersweet ending. But what if I told you that's a lie? Because when you actually start comparing their stories, the differences are so massive that they reveal something much bigger, something that changes how we should look at the entire history of Middle-earth. And trust me, by the time we're done, you're going to question everything you thought you knew about how this world really works. Here's what we're actually looking at today. No fantasy romance fairy tales, just the facts. So, if you thought this was just a nice, romantic tragedy, buckle up. Because today, we're starting at the very beginning, with the woman whose legend started it all. We need to work out what happened with Luthien first, so we can understand why the deal she got was not quite the same as Arwen's. Luthien wasn't just any elf. She was the daughter of Thingol, king of Doriath, and Melian the Maya, a literal divine being. That means Luthien wasn't just immortal. She was half-god. Before Beren entered her life, Luthien lived as all the elves of Doriath did, wrapped in an unbroken, blissful peace. She was unmatched in beauty and grace, with hair dark as night, eyes that sparkled like starlight, and luminous skin that seemed to glow with an inner light. But it was her voice that truly set her apart. So heartbreakingly lovely that it was said to melt winter into spring itself.
I mean, it makes sense. Her voice wasn't just beautiful, it was infused with Mayar power. When your mother is a divine being, I guess even your singing comes with built-in magic.
Unfair, right? One day, while dancing by the river, she caught the eye of a man, Beren. He'd been on the run from Morgoth and Sauron for years, but the moment he saw her, everything changed. He called her Tinuviel, daughter of Twilight. But before he could even speak to her, she vanished. And from that moment on, she was all he could think about. He searched for her relentlessly, and finally, on the eve of spring, he found her again. This time, he heard her singing. He ran to her, and when they finally met, in Tolkien's words, doom fell upon her. They fell in love. From then on, they met in secret, stealing time together whenever they could, and in Tolkien's own words, no other of the children of Ilúvatar have had joy so great.
Yeah, until Darren showed up. He was in love with Luthien too, got jealous, and immediately ran off to snitch to her dad. Classic.
Exactly. Darren's jealousy meant their secret was out. And suddenly, Luthien's parents knew everything. They sent guards to drag Beren before them, like some kind of criminal. But Luthien was already ahead of them. Before her parents could seize him, she brought Beren into Doriath herself. Not as a prisoner, but as an honored guest. Thingol, however, was not impressed. To him, no mere man, no matter how noble his bloodline, was worthy of his precious daughter. Not even the fact that Beren bore the Ring of Felagund, proof that his family had served an elven lord, Galadriel's own brother, no less, was enough to sway him. So Thingol set him an impossible task. To prove his worth, he had to steal a Silmaril from Morgoth's crown and bring it back to Doriath. Only then would he be allowed to marry Luthien. He just laughed, agreed to the challenge, said his goodbyes to Luthien, and set off, alone.
I mean, was this a test of worth? Or just a really elaborate way of saying, over my dead body?
Pretty much. At the time, the idea of a man and an elf wanting to be together was unheard of, and Thingol definitely wasn't going to let it happen to his princess. After Beren left, Luthien fell into a deep sadness, and her song was no longer heard in Doriath. The details of Beren's quest are a story for another video, but Luthien does get involved. More than once, actually, using her magic to help him along the way. In the end, they return to Doriath. Thingol gives them his blessing, and they get married.
Aw, a rare happy ending in Tolkien? That's nice.
Well, not so fast. Because not long after that, Beren gets chomped by some enemies they made along the way and dies.
Of course he does.
Luthien begs him to wait for her in the halls of Mandos so they can see each other again before he departs the world forever. And he waits for her. Not long after, she dies of a broken heart and follows him there.
Hang on. This isn't sounding like Arwen at all. She didn't have to give up her immortality to marry Beren. They just both die in the end?
Patience. It's not over yet. Luthien finds Beren in Mandos and sings a song so full of sorrow that the Valar still mourn when they hear it. She begs to leave the world with him, to go wherever men go after death. But Mandos doesn't have that power.
So she sang a song so sad that it escalated to divine intervention?
Pretty much. Mandos calls in the big guns, Manwë and Ilúvatar, and after hearing the story, they offer Luthien a choice.
Oh, a choice now that they're both dead? How helpful!
Right? But here's the deal. She can go to Valinor, live in bliss, and forget all her sorrow. But Beren can't come. Or she can return to Middle-earth with Beren, both of them resurrected, but as mortals. And when she dies, she'll follow him into the afterlife of men.
That's the choice? That's what people compare to Arwen's? They literally offered to bring them both back from the dead, or she never sees him again?
Yep. And obviously, she chooses to live again as a mortal. They're sent back to Middle-earth, where they live together in peace.
I still don't get why people act like this is the same as Arwen. Luthien wasn't exiled from her people for her choice, and when she died, she got to bring Beren back with her. Meanwhile, Arwen loses everything. Her family, her people, and there's no resurrection deal on the table.
Exactly. Now you're getting it. Luthien and Beren were given a second life, and in that life, they had a child. Dior, the first half-elven in Middle-earth.
But Luthien was mortal when she had him. Wouldn't that make him just mortal too?
You'd think. But we'll look into that a bit later. Not much else is known about the couple, but we can assume they lived their mortal lives and both left Arda to be together when they died. Now let's take a look at Arwen so we can really compare the two. Arwen Undomiel, the Even Star, the granddaughter of Galadriel, daughter of Elrond, and the last great elven princess of Middle-earth. Her mother, Celebrian, was the daughter of Galadriel, one of the greatest elves in history. Her father, Elrond, was the Lord of Rivendell, and a half-elf who had chosen the path of immortality. This means that Arwen wasn't just any elf. She was one of the last of the Peredhil, the half-elven. One of the very few in history who had a choice between mortality and immortality.
Remember this, it's important later.
In The Lord of the Rings, Arwen's presence in the main story is minimal, but that doesn't mean she was unimportant. Tolkien kept Arwen and Aragorn's love story out of the main narrative to maintain the adventure's pacing, but he insisted that their tale be included in the appendices, even if all the others were cut. He believed that without it, readers wouldn't fully understand the true meaning of the War of the Ring. So, although she was not a central figure in the novel, Arwen's story was essential to the lore, just as her bond with Aragorn shaped the heart of Middle-earth's history. With the choice of which kin to cleave to, Arwen likely felt an immense weight on her shoulders, as she never seems to forget the decision she must make. This is evident in her very first conversation with Aragorn, when he mistakes her for Luthien.
So many have said, she answered gravely. Yet her name is not mine, though maybe my doom will be not unlike hers. Who are you?
This wasn't flirting, and she wasn't offering Aragorn anything. She didn't even know who he was. To her, he was just some random boy running through the woods looking foolish. Aragorn may have fallen in love at first sight, but Arwen? She barely gave him a second thought. He was far too immature for her, and it would be decades before she returned his feelings. But the fact that she brought up Luthien in this moment suggests it was always on her mind, something she thought about often, even with strangers. And it wasn't just her who felt the weight of the decision she would have to make. Elrond, her loving father, clearly felt the weight of Arwen's choice long before she did. By the end of that very year, which is incredibly fast for an elf, he had already warned Aragorn away. He told him he couldn't have a wife until he was king of Gondor, setting an almost impossible bar. Elrond, who had witnessed thousands of years of history, knew exactly what was coming. He had lived through his own brother making the choice after all, and to Arwen, he made it brutally clear. If she chose to stay, she would lose everything. Her family, her people, her home.
I guess he calls that the supportive dad approach of, if you marry this man, you'll never see me again.
Yep. And he meant it. Because if she wanted to stay with Aragorn, she would have to give up her immortality and accept the gift Iluvatar made to men. Basically, she would die. And with Elrond leaving Middle-earth for the Undying Lands, this wasn't just a goodbye. It was forever. Once Arwen became mortal, she would never be allowed to sail to Valinor, never see her father again, never reunite with her mother. And that was the so-called choice that was so similar to Luthien's. Why they said Arwen was following her path.
Now wait just a minute. These don't sound similar in the slightest. Arwen not only had to give up her immortality, but she was barred from ever seeing her family again. Did Luthien get the same deal?
Nope. We don't know much about Luthien's mortal life, but what we do know makes it pretty clear she wasn't completely cut off. Her father Thingol accepted her son Dior as his heir, and her mother Melian even sent messages to them. So, yeah, she was still in contact with her family.
I don't get it. So the only similarity is that they both gave up immortality for love? I mean, yeah, that's a big deal. But this just feels off. Like there's something else going on here that we're not seeing.
I was hoping you would notice that. It's because something is off. And the more you look at these two situations, the worse it gets. Let's take a look, shall we? Two immortal elves fall hopelessly in love with mortal men, ultimately choosing to give up their immortality just to be with their soulmates. Romantic, tragic, and frankly predictable. It's no surprise everyone assumes Arwen was just following in Luthien's footsteps. But was she actually following in her ancestor's footsteps? Or did the Valar just want us all to believe that? Let's look at why these two stories are always lumped together, and then tear that idea to shreds. Alright, first things first. Let's play along and look at why everyone's convinced Arwen and Lúthien are basically copy-paste elf princesses. The biggest similarity everyone jumps to, of course, is that Arwen literally looked like Luthien reborn. Sounds poetic, right? But here's the kicker. It might actually be true. Because Arwen's grandmother, Galadriel, you know, the tall, scary one with the mind-reading mirror, was literally friends with Luthien's mom. So she probably saw Luthien at some point. If Galadriel says Arwen looked like Luthien, who are we to argue? So what else do these two have in common? Oh, just the small detail that they're both elven royalty. Luthien's dad? Thingol, full-blown elven king of Doriath, ruler of one of the most powerful realms of the First Age. Proper royal treatment, golden halls, fancy feasts, the whole deal. Arwen's dad? Elrond, Lord of Rivendell. Technically not a king, but honestly, Elrond basically functioned as one. He had a fortress-sized library, a home full of elves who listened to him like a ruler, and he gave Aragorn, the literal king-to-be, an ultimatum. If it looks like a king, rules like a king, and lectures like a king. So, yeah, both Luthien and Arwen weren't just elves. They were princesses. They had power, influence, and most importantly, very opinionated dads. Which brings us nicely to our next similarity. Turns out, neither of these dads were exactly thrilled about their daughters falling for mortal men. In fact, both Thingol and Elrond took the Meet the Parents experience to a whole new level by sending their future sons-in-law on near impossible quests. As we've already seen, both men actually managed to pull off their impossible quests and win the girl, who, of course, gave up her immortality to marry her soulmate. Well done, boys. But before we wrap up, there's one more interesting little connection. Both Beren and Aragorn wore the Ring of Peredhil, the exact same ring passed down through the generations. Which, yes, does mean that Arwen and Aragorn are technically related, but that's a story for another time. Alright, time for the differences. Starting with the fact that the stakes of their choices weren't even in the same league. Luthien got the ultimate do-over. She and Beren were already dead, and her choice wasn't about losing something, it was about getting him back. She literally negotiated with Mandos, got a one-on-one chat with the Divine, and walked away with exactly what she wanted. Beren alive, herself mortal, and their lives pretty much unchanged after that. Arwen? Yeah. No divine negotiations for her. No room for debate. No celestial reset button. Just an impossible, cruel choice. Give up her soulmate or her family and her entire race. Luthien was given a second chance. Arwen? She was exiled. No negotiation, no special treatment. Just good luck figuring out your own suffering. And before anyone says, but they both chose mortality for love, let's take a look at how very different those sacrifices actually were. Now here's where things start to get weird. Because for some reason, Luthien's child was a half-elf, but Arwen's wasn't. You'd think it would be the other way around, right? Luthien literally died and was resurrected in a mortal body, so it would make sense for her kids to be full human. But nope. Her son, Dior, was half-elven. Meanwhile, Arwen just made a decision. No changes to her body. But somehow, her children aren't elves at all? What's up with that? So clearly, this wasn't just a biological thing. There's something very, very different about how these choices actually work. And we're starting to suspect the Valar were making up rules as they went. And that's not the only thing that doesn't add up. Because when we look at how they actually died, the differences get even stranger. Okay, so let's talk about the actual end of their stories. Because this is where we start getting into seriously shady territory. Here's the thing. Luthien and Beren actually grew old together. In fact, she's called the only elf to ever die of old age. That's weird, right? Because she was still elven enough to have a half-elven child. Now, Arwen? She didn't age alongside Aragorn. When he decided to check out early, yeah, let's talk about that, by the way, she wasn't even ready to die yet. I give back the gift of life. Yeah, must be real nice when you're the one who gets to leave first. Meanwhile, Arwen, who gave up everything for this guy, now has to just figure it out. And she doesn't even die of old age. She wanders alone in her grandmother's abandoned home for a full year, and then she dies of heartbreak. Which, by the way, is an elf death. Like, what exactly did she gain here? She didn't get to grow old with Aragorn. She didn't get to die alongside him. She didn't age normally. She was still physically elven in every way she didn't want to be. And yet, she was cut off from Valinor forever. This wasn't a mortal life. This was exile. And that begs the question, was her choice actually real at all? Because when you take a step back, the gift of choosing mortality starts looking a lot less like freedom, and a lot more like a punishment. So after everything we've covered, let's make one thing crystal clear. Luthien's choice? It had nothing to do with Arwen's. It wasn't part of some great noble tradition, and it sure as hell wasn't the origin of the so-called Peredhil choice. Luthien's fate was a special one-off deal, granted to her because she was half Ainur, and she literally sang the most heartbreaking song the world had ever heard. Her story ends in bittersweet triumph, but it's got nothing to do with Arwen, the Peredhil, or the so-called gift of mortality. But Arwen's choice? That's something else entirely. And it didn't come from Mandos, or Ilúvatar's grace. It was something much, much darker. Because if you want to understand the Peredhil choice, the one forced on Elrond and Elros, and eventually Arwen, you have to look at a very different interaction in Valinor. One that reveals exactly what the Valar really think about men. This so-called choice wasn't a gift. It wasn't some boon of fairness given to the half-elven. It was an enforced system designed to split bloodlines, erase unwanted hybrids, And, most importantly, keep men the heck out of Valinor. And once you realize that, you start to see the Valar's discrimination for what it really is. And next time, we're pulling the whole system apart. If you think this gift of the Valar sounds more like a curse, you're not going to want to miss what's coming next. So hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because trust me, things are about to get a whole lot worse.